Good morning, Penny. My name's Kevin. This is my wife, Janet. We are the Lullies. Usually we're accompanied by our daughters, Madison and Jenna, and we're going to be doing the reading this morning.
Our reading this morning is from John 18, verses 1 through 14. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he had asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people.
Good morning, church family. We are, as you know, not having services in person this weekend. My family and I are on vacation, but I do want to let you know, remind you that in-person services will return next weekend, March 6th and 7th. All of our regular services, Saturday night, 2 on Sunday morning, those will all be returning as usual next weekend, March 6th and 7th. And of course, also online resources for worship at home continuing to be posted as well. So next weekend we return, and Lord willing, we'll continue to meet in person straight through as we head toward Easter. As we head toward Easter, we've said a number of times that we are looking at John's account of the crucifixion between now and then, the account of Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion. And today, we start with the account of Jesus' arrest, the text that the Lullies have just read. A text that shows us Jesus in all of his courage. Jesus faces the darkest night of his human life. He faces a threatening detachment of soldiers, his enemies coming for blood, chaos among his followers, and he faces it with great courage. C.S. Lewis said that courage is the form of every virtue in its testing point. Courage is the form of every virtue at its testing point. And what he meant is something like this. Think of any virtue, any good characteristic that we need to foster in our lives. Think of faithfulness or honesty. Faithfulness to our spouse, faithfulness to our friends, faithfulness to our duty. Or honesty, the commitment to tell the truth. Those are virtues. Those are good ways of living that are honoring to God and in accord with the moral reality of the universe under a holy God. Those are virtues. But courage, C.S. Lewis said, is every virtue at its testing point. And you don't really know how faithful you are or how honest you are until your honesty or your faithfulness is tested. And courage, C.S. Lewis said, is doing the right thing when your virtue is tested. So your faithfulness to your spouse when you're tempted with a chance to violate her trust. Or faithfulness to a friend when it's easier to throw them under the bus. Or faithfulness to your duty when it will be require sacrifice for you to fulfill your vows. Courage is faithfulness at its testing point. Not when it's easy to do it, but precisely when it's hard. Or honesty, of course, when it's easy sometimes to tell the truth. There are other times when telling the truth will cost you maybe everything. Courage is telling the truth then. This is what Lewis says courage is. What we see here in Jesus is Jesus at the ultimate testing point, with the threat of violence, with much chaos around him, with everyone else turning and fleeing, abandoning him. Jesus at that moment stands firm, and what we see is the same consistent character of Jesus with his love for others, with his commitment to the truth. What we see is the same consistent character of Jesus in the ultimate testing point. Jesus is courageous. And I hope then that as we look at that today, we might learn something about what it means for us in a secondary way as his followers to be courageous as well. What does Christian courage look like? Or even better, what is the foundation for Christian courage? How can we have it? What do we have to build courage on, to steady and prepare our hearts so when we are tested like Christ, we might be able to stand with a courage that reflects something, at least, of his. What is Christian courage? I think it's founded on three things. And this text shows us three things it's founded on. Anyway, Christian courage is founded on, is based on knowing who Jesus is, knowing what Jesus has done, and knowing who we are. In that order. Knowing who Jesus is, knowing what Jesus has done, and knowing who we are. I just want to think with you simply about these three things in light of this text. And we'll do that by looking through the story. Now we need to set the scene first. Jesus is betrayed here. He's betrayed by Judas. And the reason a betrayal is needed is because his enemies wanted to take Jesus into custody. And indeed, they held his trial overnight. They wanted to take him into custody. They wanted to try him and find him guilty because they knew what the verdict was going to be before they held the trial. They wanted to arrest him and try him, find him guilty, and crucify him, and they wanted to do as much of that as they could away from the watching eyes of the broader community. They wanted to take him at night, not during the day in the temple where he was every day. They wanted to take him at night when the crowds weren't watching. Why did they want to do that? Well, often if you're doing something that is not right, you want to do it under cover of darkness. That is part of what is happening here. It's also due to the popularity of Jesus. They didn't want to cause a great disruptance by taking him during the temple during the day when people might shout and protest and say, you can't do that. They wanted they wanted the verdict to be guilty. They wanted to put him to death. It was all arranged in advance. The plot had been forming for a long time. They wanted nothing to stand in their way, so they wanted to take him away from prying eyes, away from the sight of the public, take him at night, try him overnight, and crucify him before noon or by noon the next day. But in order to do that, in order to carry out their plot, they needed to know where Jesus was. There were thousands of pilgrims in Jerusalem at this time. It was the time of the Passover festival. And pilgrims would come into the temple during the day, all kinds of pilgrims there in the temple area, but then they would go out and stay different places at night. How do you find Jesus at night if you're going to take him? Well, they needed an inside man, and they found that man in Judas Iscariot. Judas, the beginning of chapter 18, leads, Judas came to the garden, verse 3, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Judas leads his enemies among the Pharisees. Judas leads various officials from the temple, no doubt, and the Sanhedrin. And Judas leads a detachment of soldiers. Jesus' most most serious enemies, coming with a detachment of soldiers. A detachment of soldiers is literally a cohort of soldiers, and that could mean 600 soldiers, that could mean 200 soldiers. But understand, this is a lot of soldiers, and these are hardened soldiers, used to putting down riots and disturbances in the temple area. This is no group to be messed with, and they are out for blood and carrying lanterns, torches, and weapons, and led by a betrayer who brings them right to Jesus. They come upon him at night. This is where we start. This is where Jesus is. But notice the courage of Jesus. Jesus, verse 4, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Jesus, knowing what would happen to him. John emphasizes this again and again. Jesus is never portrayed as naive. He knows exactly what is bearing down on him. He knows the bloodlust that is looking for him, seeking him out with these hardened soldiers and these religious officials. Knowing what will happen to him, though, Jesus doesn't waver. He doesn't run. Instead, he went out. Meaning perhaps that the garden that they were in seems to have been some kind of walled enclosure, some kind of walled garden. And Jesus steps out from the wall, steps out, approaches this detachment of soldiers, these Pharisees, this betrayer. He comes to them and says to them, "Who is it you want?" Now they answer, Jesus of Nazareth. And then there's a very mysterious verse. "I am he," Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with him. Verse 6, when Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Now I have to tell you, this is, there's some mystery around this. I wonder at this. What overwhelms these hardened soldiers and these religious officials that they fall back from him? There's something mysterious going on here. I think perhaps the best explanation is this. Jesus regularly his eyewitnesses regularly said, even his enemies said, that Jesus spoke as one with authority. That Jesus was known as one with a commanding presence, even when he was just teaching in the temple courts and the synagogue or on a hillside. He spoke with this profound and deep authority. And so here it is at night, that authority that overwhelmed people in other circumstances, in the middle of the day, again, in the temple or on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Here they are at night, perhaps on a slope. You know, the garden was on top of a mountain, perhaps on a steep slope, all coming in together. And here now comes Jesus coming toward them, speaking with the same authority, saying, "Who is it you want?" They say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he doesn't run, he doesn't evade. He says, "I am he." And they're overwhelmed with awe. They fall backwards. You know, this is what Leon Morris, who's one commentator, says. The soldiers had come out secretly to arrest a fleeing peasant, so they thought. But in the gloom, they find themselves confronted by a commanding figure who, far from running away, comes out to meet them and speaks in the language of deity. Speaks in the language of deity. Now here's the other thing that's happening here. Not only does Jesus come out and speak with authority, he speaks, as Morris says, with the language of deity. What Morris is referring to are the words that Jesus speaks here. The NIV, our NIV translates it, "I am he." It repeats these words twice, "I am he." But the Greek literally is ego eimi, or I am. Words that Jesus said on a number of different occasions, language that is the language of deity. In John chapter 8, when Jesus confronts the Pharisees and is having this back and forth conversation with them, the point at which they want to attack him and tried to kill him for blasphemy is a point in which he says, before Abraham was, I am. Same words, ego eimi, I am. I am. Not I was, not I will be, both I am. I am. The everlasting, eternally present one. That's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here in the middle of the night, Jesus, as he has done on other occasions, before Abraham was, I am. Here he steps out, a commanding presence, not running, instead speaking in the language of deity. We want Jesus of Nazareth, they say. Jesus replies, I am. This is the moment of greatest evil, offense, and tragedy in the world. The God who made the world in love comes into the world he made, and humanity kills him horribly. As we've said before, it gets no worse than that. And yet Jesus here, heading toward into this dark night, is not thrown off. He's not in a panic. He is still masterful. He is still in control. He is still the I am. He knew everything that would happen to him, not just death, also his coming resurrection. Darkness is falling. He knows the darkness that is coming. Joy will come on Easter morning. He knows the joy on Easter morning. And for the joy set before him, as Hebrews says, he goes out. Jesus, who is Jesus? Jesus is the I am, masterful, knowledgeable, deep in wisdom, sovereign in his power, gloriously good in his intended purposes. Jesus, not thrown off for a moment, but masterfully in control. Christian courage starts with knowing who Jesus is. You need to know who Jesus is. See him here. See him in the garden. At the darkest moment of history, even then as the I am, still sovereign, still intending good. If Jesus was not thrown off then, if he wasn't shaken then, if he wasn't trembling then, if he wasn't running away then, if he didn't abandon his disciples then, if in that dark moment that was true of Jesus, then you can know the same will be true when the world throws you a curve. When you face a dark night of the soul, when everything around you is shaken, God will not be thrown off. Jesus is not undone. This is why we are not a rock. Not truly, but Jesus is our rock, our refuge, our strength, our immovable foundation. If he was then, he is now. Now, they approach, and they recover, rather, and approach him. These soldiers knocked backwards now recover and approach him. They drew back, it says in verse 7. Again, he asked them, who is it that you want? They say, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I told you, verse 8, that I am he. Now listen to these words. They're coming back, 200 to 600 soldiers, Pharisees, lanterns, torches, weapons. They come toward him. And Jesus says, I told you, I'm he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go. Is that something? If you are looking for me, let these men go. Now what is he doing? It's a classic substitute move, isn't it? You take me, let them go. If you want Jesus of Nazareth, I'm not going to hide that from you. That's me. You take me, but you let these other guys go. Now that is a wonderful act of courage. But that's not all. John tells us something else about it. Verse 9. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. John says there's more going on here. It's a fulfillment of prophecy, and a specific prophecy. When Jesus prophesied and said, I will not lose, I have not lost one of those you gave me. Now, when did Jesus say that? John 6:39. In John 6:39, Jesus said that. Listen carefully to what Jesus said. John 6:39. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I shall lose none of all those he has given me, but raise them up on the last day. Now, Jesus is being courageous. He's saying, take me, let them go. He's substituting himself, putting himself right into harm's way in order to save the physical lives on that night of his disciples. But John says there's more going on than that. He is not just here substituting for those disciples in that moment. This is the beginning of his substitution of himself for all of those who are his own, to save not only our physical lives, but our eternal souls. That's what he says in John 6:39. I will lose none of those you give me, but I will raise them up on the last day. That is the resurrection to the new heavens and the new earth. That is the life after this life. That is eternity in the presence of God. That is when Jesus will take death and finally and ultimately defeat it once and for all and raise up to never-ending life all those who are his own. That is what Jesus is talking about in John 6:39. That is what Jesus is doing right here in the garden. He's doing it through substitution. I won't lose any of my own. So let them go, take me. See, John is saying, this is what Jesus did, not only for them that night, this is what Jesus did for you when you trust in him. For you, Christian who believe in him. Jesus says, let you go, take me. Sin does separate us from a holy God. It puts us in deserved spiritual peril, unavoidable spiritual eternal death, unless something is done, and that's what Jesus does here. This is the substitution. Do you see it? It's not just knowing who Jesus is, the I am, unthrown, unshaken, immovable, but it's also knowing what he did that night in the garden, that next day on the cross. Jesus said, let me be forsaken so that you can be accepted. Jesus said, let me be captured so that you can go free. Jesus said, take me into this dark night, let them be brought into the light. Jesus said, let me die so that they may live for eternity, so that you may live for eternity. Jesus has won the day for you so that you will never be lost. Jesus says, I will not lose you, even if it costs greatly me. I saw a funeral once a while back of a wonderful Christian brother who had lost tragically his wife at a young age. He said, in speaking to the crowd at the funeral, the gathered crowd to mourn at the funeral, he said, honestly, we miss her greatly. We're so sad for what has happened. But he said, we don't say here in our family that we've lost her. He said, when I lose my keys, I don't know where they are. And he said, my wife is not lost because we know exactly where she is. She's with her Lord and Savior in glory. And one day we will go to be where she is and see her there. Now that kind of confidence, that kind of courage in facing death does not come from us. That comes from knowing who Jesus is and what he has done. Dying and rising in our place so that we would never be lost if we put our trust in him, so that even in death we would be home with him. To have Christian courage, the foundation for Christian courage is knowing who Jesus is, knowing what Jesus has done, and last thing, it is knowing who you are, who I am. Now, there is one last sentence. Jesus says, I've told you that I'm he. I've not lost one of those you've given me. And then we have the account of Simon Peter, and he just loses his marbles. Peter is all over the place in these last chapters. I say loses marbles. I mean, who can blame him here? Peter picks up a sword, he swings it, cuts off a right ear. A few verses later, he's acting with this impulsive, wild violence. Then just a couple of verses later, somebody asks Peter, 3 times he's asked, in fact, do you know this Jesus? And then all of a sudden he's fearful and running away, denying Jesus, saying, no, I don't know him. He's impulsively acting out, striking with a sword, and then he's cursing and lying and saying, I never knew Jesus. He's all over the place. He's not steady. He's not a rock. And I think it's because in this moment, Peter doesn't know who he is. He takes matters into his own hands. He swings a sword. He cuts off the high priest's ear. And Jesus then gives him a command. He says, put your sword away. Now, to be clear, I don't think that is a command here. This text is not a command for all Christians of all time. Put your swords away. Never use a weapon. That's not what is happening here. This is Jesus' command to Peter in this instance. Because listen to what Jesus says. He said to Peter, he commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? In other words, Jesus is saying, in this instance, Peter, you don't know what you're doing. You don't know you don't know what God is doing. I don't need your wisdom. I don't need your help. I don't need you to defend me. Put your sword away, Peter. I am going through with this. Peter, in other words, needs to learn something here about himself, that he is not God. Peter, trust me and put your sword away. He's not God. He doesn't have the wisdom of God. He doesn't know what's going on. He wants to handle things his own way. That's not God's way. He doesn't actually have the strength to stop this. He's one guy with a sword. There's a detachment of battle-hardened soldiers, hundreds in number there. This is not going to end well for Peter. Peter, you don't have the ability to deliver Jesus from this situation, right, Peter? Put your sword away. You're not God. What do you think you're doing? He doesn't know. He's afraid. And he's acting as if, in his fear, he can control a situation that he can't. But he's not God. Now look, I say this to Peter, but isn't that what we do? Don't we sometimes act out of fear and try to take control of situations or try to act out in situations as if we can fix them? That's not courage. That's foolishness. That's what Peter does here. Are we going to save the church for God? Who are we to save it? We're going to protect God's reputation? We've got to defend him? We get worried? Who are we? Are we going to keep his word, his world from going off the rails? We can't do that. As if God needs that. As if we could do that. There's actually a lot of spiritual health that comes from knowing that we are not God and that we cannot control most of the things that we worry the most about. It is better and healthier to remind ourselves and to learn again and again and again that this world is not under our control. It's under God's. That we cannot run things on our schedule or our timeline or protect ourselves perfectly from every danger. We can't. We're not God. And furthermore, we don't have God's wisdom. When we try to run things in our own way, under our own control, as if we were God, we often end up doing things that we aren't even right. There is a God. It's not us. There is a rock. That's not us. There is the great I Am who has saved us, but that's Jesus. That's not Peter. That's not you and me. We need to know who Jesus is, the great I Am. We need to know what he's done for us, and we need to know who we are, which actually has two parts. One, we're not God, but who we are, who you are, Christian, is one who is loved by God deeply at great cost. Peter is not God, but he's loved by God. Peter is not Jesus, but he's loved by Jesus. In all of his frailty, in all of his fickleness, in all of his sin. Christian, in all of your frailty, in all of your fickleness, in all of your sin, you're loved by God. Jesus here shows that to Peter in what he does for him. Jesus knew, Jesus had full knowledge of Peter. He knew he was going to fly off and lash out impulsively. He knew he was going to deny him just a matter of minutes after that. And yet, knowing Peter, knowing all of his failings, knowing everything else, It is also about Peter that Jesus speaks when he says to the mob, "Take me, leave him. Substitute me for him." And this is what Christ has done for you. You are not God, but astonishingly, wonderfully, incredibly God, who doesn't need you, doesn't need your wisdom, doesn't need your help, doesn't need your company. He's full of wisdom, He's full of love, He's full of goodness, He's perfectly happy. He doesn't need to save you from your sin. Justly, He could just condemn you to be apart from Him. He doesn't need you, but He loves you. He chooses you. He calls you. The Father sends His Son. The Son sacrifices His life. The Holy Spirit brings this gospel to you now, saying, you are a loved daughter or son. That is the ultimate basis of Christian courage. Know who you are. To Him, the great I Am, who will not lose you. May God bless you. May you know the love of Jesus for you. I look forward to seeing you again soon.